Okay. So, we're here today to do Zeitgeist Melbourne Radio Episode 3. Bit of a discussion on politics. Now, there's going to be some very complicated concepts in this episode. I'm still coming to grips with them myself. So is Sunny. Say hi, Sunny.
Hello, everyone.
And we're going to go through them anyway, try and flesh them out a bit and try and understand how the movement's a bit different than some of them and the tensions involved inherently in the political movements themselves. Given that we hear these terms a lot, terms such as left and right, libertarian, socialist, anarchist, communist, capitalist, etc., etc. So it's important to understand these terms and what they mean, and then we can try and flesh out the tensions a bit in the political space of current society and where we potentially could be.
Wicked. I am presently working on... fantastic. I can share it from here to all our other groups. We have an outline here, and our outline is going to start with talking about the present political situation in Australia, UK, and the US. It's the countries that I'd say most of us are either familiar with firsthand because we live there, or in the countries that we hear the most about in the news. So perhaps we should start with the fact that whether you're in Australia, UK, or the US, you have a two-party system. Practically a two-party dictatorship, because no one else has had a chance in the election for the last 30, 40 years.
So it's important there, before we crank that off, to clarify that the UK is not a two-party preferred system necessarily. It's a bit more European. It's got multi-parties, the Liberal Democrats, the Conservatives, or called the Tories, the Labour Party. There's 3 or 4 major parties, including parties like UKIP, the Scottish Independence Party as well. So it's not quite as simple as that for the UK, although they do end up forming coalitions, and there's always a party in control, a coalition in control, just like in Australia, with the large L Liberal and Nationals, and then the Labour Party. There's something similar happening in the UK as well. Now, two-party preferred systems, or dictatorships, as we're claiming them, which is a very loaded term, obviously, we go down a track of the idea that one party attains a certain amount of a majority in Parliament, whether they be seats or some other metric by which we measure the people's representation, and they then form a government and can create legislation, enact laws, etc., etc. There's a real problem with this, I think, or potentially a problem with this, in terms of the idea that when you vote with a party, you're not necessarily represented by that party. So the great example here come up really recently, and has been in the last 7 or 8 years of Australian politics. There's been something fascinating going on where we've switched leaders 5 times in system isn't working. Why are we switching leaders so much? I think it's actually the one part of the system that is semi-responsive to current structures, because it's not very responsive in general. But this particular idea that the party can change leaders, I think
it's based on public opinion. It genuinely is based on public opinion.
It seems that way, yes. It seems to be driven by the poll numbers and popularity, and reactions to policy from the Abbott government were not very good. You could argue that
reactions to Abbott were not very good.
Yes, and the way he sold his policy, sure. But the other example there is Rudd was thrown out because people didn't think he was governing well. There was lots of stories in the media about him, and then they went to the last election the Labor Party did in Australia, I should mention, with Rudd at the helm, because all opinion polls said that the Australian people preferred Rudd to Gillard leading the Labor Party. So it's this idea that a lot of people looked at what was happening in current Australian politics and said, well, this is a broken aspect of our system. Why can't we maintain a leader for more than X amount of years? And I think it's the one part of it, or one of the few parts of it, that is truly, or potentially, let me change that, potentially representative.
I would just say that the kind of question people should ask is, if we got two parties, I mean,
well, we got a coalition and a Labor Party.
Ask yourself the idea that your opinions on everything, you're buying into one bucket of ideas and you're thinking the same as half the people in this country about things like gay rights, gay marriage, climate change, refugees, economic policy, foreign policy, bombing countries. I mean, the notion that like we could have a system where we don't vote on these issues, we just pick a party that has a position on one of those issues, and then we're happy to go, is, I'd say, quite faulty. And I would say politicians themselves, you have to be a total hypocrite to say, or really, really stupid to say, hey, these are my beliefs and stands on all those issues, and they're exactly the same as these other 300 guys, and we all form a party. I would say it just doesn't. It kind of crushes the idea of like people thinking for themselves.
Well, the funny thing is that I think you're totally right there, but the tension for me in that respect is borne out by the idea that if you vote for X party, whether it be the coalition in your area or the Labor Party in your area, and they go to vote, they don't represent you. You vote for what the party votes for, the value systems of the party itself. So what I was talking about before and what we were getting to, which leads in nicely from your comments, is the idea that you don't actually elect a person and his opinion and his ideology. Like, people are really happy all of a sudden that Turnbull is in government and he's leading the Liberal Party. He's our Prime Minister, and there was an upswing in the polls because they think that he can change what's going on in the political space because of his ideas. But the problem, of course, is that that's not the case. And the example, of course, being borne out in front of us is that he came in, one of the first things he did was say that I'm not going to change on the gay marriage proposal that Abbott put forward, and I'm not going to change on climate change, even though those were two important points that the political left, the mainstream left, the Labor Party and Labor voters liked about Turnbull. They liked the fact that this guy was pro-gay rights in one respect and pro-climate change. And so they're happy that he's elected because they're like, great, there's this guy who's going to lead the Liberal Party, who's going to say this stuff and do these things. But of course he's not. He had to make a deal with the Nationals to get into power. The coalition has to be formed based on a contract. And he has to please the right wing of his party who liked Abbott, who don't like him at the helm and are very conservative, are very anti those views. So he can't. He has no particularly large agency. He might have some sway, but he has no particular large agency to actually implement those policies. He can't do that. So there's this idea that we think people we elect are going to represent us because we voted them in, and the majority of people
themselves.
Exactly, like they represent themselves and their party. A great example is something like gay marriage, or in the US, it's gun control laws. So in the US, for example, you have 80% of gun owners and the general public who support reasonable gun legislation. Yeah. And this has come up recently again, obviously, with the shootings in Oregon, which are horrific, and our hearts go out. But the idea is that that's almost a non-starter for most people. Like, it's done. Like, 80% of people support a little bit of reasonable background checking and gun control legislation. But they can't get it passed because the party votes the way the party wants based on the party's interests. And the party's interests in the US, both Democrat and the Conservatives, the Republicans, is founded in the gun lobby, in the NRA,
the gun lobby is powerful. I mean,
it's huge. But this is the point. It's the party politics it's involved in two-party dictatorship, especially, is non-representative. It doesn't work as a representation system. You can't tell me that Malcolm Turnbull, his views and what he's doing right now actually represents a broad spectrum of the Australian public. The Australian public and people in Western countries in general are well polled. Yeah. They're well polled, well surveyed. Yeah. And their views are quite known in terms of universal healthcare, in terms of universal education, in terms of gun control, in terms of anti-war movements. But the government does what it wants anyway. Yes. Based on the party interests. It doesn't have a necessary tie to the people it's meant to be representing. So this idea that we get stuck between one and the other is part of the, I think we're going to go into this later, but part of the charade. Yeah. So, we have kind of the leftist party of the mainstream politics, which is nowhere near left, which is the Labor or the Democrats or the British Labor Party, and then we have the right, which is the Australian Liberal Party, the Republicans and the Conservatives or the Tories in the UK, and we flip between the two, or coalitions involving those parties, without really changing anything and without ever getting to a representative system, like a representative model. So we don't really move into this space where this two-party system actually represents us. It's almost too plain to see. Yeah. But we get sucked back into it, I think, because we're given these choices that are limited by these two parties. So, we're told not to vote. Like I had a massive conversation, a debate with a friend of mine who's a very learned guy. He's a lefty progressive. He normally votes Greens, etc., etc. But when Abbott won, and this is in Australia, of course, when Tony Abbott won first, the first time he won and became Prime Minister when he ran against ran against Rudd, because Rudd ousted her at the last minute before the election, as I've talked about previously. He said to me, "Who are you voting for?" And I said, "Actually, I'm probably going to vote Greens." He said, don't. You gotta, you've really got to vote. Like, we got to get behind Rudd." And I said, "No." I said, I don't think he's going to win, unfortunately, because the Labor Party's been in such disarray recently, so much infighting. 2, that's the short game. Like, we get sucked back into this two-party dichotomy, this dictatorship. Because we're told not to vote for anyone else because they can't achieve power, and what we're going to do is we're going to sacrifice the short-term game for the long-term goal, when I think we should be focused more on the long-term goal. So if we have a look at, for example, governments in the EU, including the UK government, we get a much more reasoned discussion around these policies because they have multi-party systems. It's not just two. It's not just, stop the boats or free education. For example, in Australia, it's not like that in countries where they have more than just the two parties. Now, I don't agree with party politics in general, but the two-party dictatorship is this particularly cynical / detrimental version of party politics, which suckers you into this false dichotomy all the time. Left, which is not left, and right, which is not right, but more kind of right-centrist parties that don't actually work for anyone.
May I just say also, the reason why, first of all, who does a two-party system suit? Well, it suits all external interest groups. Because if you've got two parties that are neck and neck...
All external interest groups or some?
Pretty much all of them.
Why is
that? It's much easier to sway a balanced system where there's two even parties. You literally fund one over the other. 1 or 2% of voters. It's easier to sway 1 or 2% of voters than it is if in a two-party system, because there's simply when we have elections in Australia, in 90% of residents, their votes are almost irrelevant because the seats haven't changed for 20 elections. So there's this notion of swing seats. And only those votes matter most. And so, external interest groups can apply pressure and get an election swung one way or the other. Which makes the political system, which makes the political parties a lot more dependent on things like the gun lobby in America, the coal lobby in Australia, various corporate think tanks, various corporate funding organizations. Because that way... compare this. If you have a dictator in a country or a one-party system, you have some kind of one party China, but there is some kind of an election within the party where these bureaucrats vote for each other. Can you imagine getting China to pass a law that they take no tariffs on on imports on Australian coal, for example? Like, us influencing Chinese policy would be 10 times harder than a coal company influencing the Australian policy on a certain issue. because when you have an evenly balanced parliament, you just push it. $20-30 million of a TV campaign scaring people away from the mining tax.
Great example, yeah.
Will stop something like the mining tax, which is such a cheap. They cut that thing off so cheaply. And if you think about, if we had a strong government, say like a single party, we're taxing you. Like, there is no amount of, that little campaign would have done nothing.
You can still bribe the politicians, and this has come out recently in Chinese politics. There's been a lot of bribery scandals at the highest levels. I see what you're saying. It's harder to influence those politics if you're an external company.
Yeah.
But I mean, yes and no, because you've got to at least pick your horse in multi-parties. You don't have to pick your horse. You just go to the relevant guy and give him money.
And let me just let's elaborate on why our governments, UK, US, Australia, are not very democratic. Well, I'll lose on my own. So you have to ask yourself where the policies that they write and create are written. Who are the bureaucrats? Because you don't necessarily vote for the guy that's going to write the legislation that's going to regulate, say, the coal industry, the insurance companies, the hedge fund industry, the stock trading or anything like that. So most legislation is written in policy think tanks. Think tanks like in Australia we have, the Chatham House International Affairs think tank, Royal RIAA, Royal Institute of International Affairs. We've got various industry interest groups, and what they do is that they write foreign policy for Australia that's slanted both to the right, to the left. Who sits in these councils? Well, basically people that represent various international corporations, multinational bodies like, World Bank, IMF, UN, and so on. And so what you have is a bunch of unelected people who are representing the interests, for the most part, of large multinational corporations, writing policy for both parties, on the right and on the left. And, in America there was a big deal, and it was tied to all kinds of things, from something called the New World Order, to communism, to the Illuminati. But the bottom line is, you have something like the Council on Foreign Relations, or the Trilateral Commission, and if you look who sits on it, for the most part it's unelected people that represent, Fortune 100 corporations that write. The best example would be two sets of healthcare legislation. One where the insurance companies profit by every single person in America being forced to buy health insurance from them. This is called a socialist version. It's basically designed for corporate profit. The other one is the capitalist version, where they profit because they can exclude anyone from being insured. They can charge whatever they want. They can have essentially predatory contracts, and they profit that way. So basically what you have is a bunch of non-elected people more or less governing how the country is run in a way that relatively well aligns with the rhetoric that the politicians are saying. But the bottom line is, whose interests are being met.
Well, it's interesting because what we get to is a consensus on that idea of a kind of a business underset to all politics and the way the world works. So the way the world works is not political necessarily, it's driven by business. There's a beautiful statement which is in a couple of docos I've seen, including some of the Zeitgeist ones, where it's out of a movie called Network in the 70s.
Classic, yeah.
Where the head of the TV station is explaining to Mr. Beale, the newscaster who loses the plot and goes all anti-establishment, that the world is a set of corporations inexorably run by the immutable bylaws of business. And these are the people that make the plans and run the world. These are the people that influence governments. These are the people that are the ones writing your policy and have control over the resources you need to live and how you survive and who runs various political bodies and whatever else. So it's a really interesting idea, but that consensus is still kind of there. So in the American context, we've already covered it. They kind of support candidates. It's happening right now in 2015. We've got the presidential run next year, so we've got the Republican candidates all. I think we're down to 15 out of 17 possibles that were in at one point. And the Democratic candidates, there's 5 of them, 6 actually, if you mainstream candidates, if you include the Harvard law professor Lawrence Lessig, who's running on just a single referendum platform. So there are these ideas that most of those candidates, not all of them, and I'll go over that in a sec, are covered by those corporate interests and those think tanks. They get their policy from there. There's video of Hillary Clinton talking at the Council for Foreign Relations where she says, she says, like, her comment is something like, "I'm glad you guys are so close, so now I can be told how to think about stuff."
Yeah,
and that's not an exact quote. But
nowadays, I only have to cross the street to be told how I should be thinking about.
And you kind of go, "Wow, that's a really odd statement on its face." It's beautifully truthful in that respect. Yeah. And it's really telling about what's actually happening. It's not, we aren't telling her how to think, and she's not representing us. She's getting told how to think and representing other interests, and we don't know what they are, which is inherently undemocratic. But let's kind of go past that for a minute and go into those kind of dichotomies between potentially people who change the system internally.
I was just going to say before we move on to our next point, there is a certain consensus of Western liberalism, which goes a little bit like this. Corporations should be able to go from country to country to country to country, relocate, coexist, and basically use difference in in various national laws to wind up paying no tax. Imports and exports should be done with almost no tariffs or no tariffs whatsoever. The idea is free trade.
Yep.
The idea is that, economic development, we're going to have economic development in the third world, which more or less constitutes this. We're going to build roads, highways, and ports to take all the stuff that major corporations are extracting from the third world to wherever the market for those goods is.
And the first world.
And the first world.
Yeah.
And the net result is, of course, record after record after record corporate profits. And, it took... People believed in this. People believed firmly in this. A vast majority of Americans believed that this kind of free trade idea was what was making the world great, pulling the world out of poverty and so on. I mean, I remember I had... it was more than 10 years ago. I read a book by Jeffrey Sachs about, climbing the ladder of progress, pulling the world out of poverty through these international development programs. And, I was a bit naive, but even at that time, I was suspicious of it. But the idea is really simple. Labor and people, they get to stay where they live, and they have to deal with the economic conditions. But corporations are infinitely agile. And the net result is, American middle class has had it worse and worse and worse, ever so slightly, practically year to year from the 1970s.
Well,
the jobs.
I pick up what you're saying, and I think we've got to paint it in the Australian context too.
Yeah.
And there's definitely the same thing going on. We've made all these trade agreements with other countries. Abbott just signed one last year before he was ousted, obviously, or this year. Might have been 14 to 15 with China, where corporations who live in Australia or who profit off Australian markets get to make stuff overseas and then bring it back here because it's cheaper to move. Now, can I just unpack this point for a sec?
Sure, go for it.
There's something really interesting in terms of the idea of trade and what it is and what it does and how it works. And I think we get caught again in these kind of dichotomies of free trade or no trade. And the reason I say that is because, so let me use an example. If we think about parties on the mainstream political right, i.e. the Australian Liberal Party, which is the big L Liberal Party. It's the Conservative Party in Australia, and the Republicans in the States. We get to this idea of trade is good and business is good, and we should lower government barriers because government is bad and government interferes in the market, and the market should be willing to work its magic. But of course, they're also the same parties that put up the fences for people. They don't want people to come into the country, or they reduce migration, or they make it harder for people to get residency. So this tension plays out in the political sphere in that way. And you have...
Why should money be able to move so much and people so little?
Well, it's quite interesting because if people could move around freely, let's say we had teleporters, or let's say we had free transnational movement where people could just relocate countries, there'd be no point in Holden making cars in Korea because movement is free. They would earn as much as Melbourne workers do. It would unfortunately be a race to the bottom then.
Yeah,
but there'd be almost no point in moving. And like if you look at what and I'm going to get back to the American example because I have more experience with my media at the moment on those guys because I'm watching the presidential run. You have the Republicans talking about the fact that China's beating us and we're not making anything anymore. And their premise is not to raise the minimum wage and to get manufacturing back because they want to bring corporations back through government. They don't want to tell corporations, if you trade here, you must make here.
Yeah.
What they want to do is lower the minimum wage or remove it completely so that the American worker can make $2 a day competing with China, and that will make the jobs come back. And you kind of go, wow, how do we get to this point where it's either free trade completely, where money has the ability to go global and we have no control over it whatsoever, and we have to lower tariffs to get more free trade going, or we get stuck with the idea of a national movement where we only make our own stuff and the tariffs are so high that we don't have any international trade. So again, we've got to think about tariffs and taxes and import taxes and duties as ways to try and equal the playing field for the Australian, American, the European worker who is trying to compete for manufacturing jobs with
what Americans
China.
don't know. What Americans don't know is...
Oh, they probably do.
They don't. In the sort of heyday, in the economic heyday of America leading up, in the exponential growth for maybe the 35, 40 years before the Great Depression, so the turn of the 19th to the 20th century, America had massive tariffs.
Huge. The tax rates were massive in the 50s under Eisenhower, under a Republican president.
Yeah.
The tax rate of the wealthiest was 90%. It's huge.
And, they achieved this, the status of becoming the world's biggest superpower, first of all, taking parity with England, Germany, France, Russia, and then exceeding all of them by applying a system that had way less free trade than those countries that rivaled them. To go along with that, they also had the rise of the middle class. And a favourite commentator of mine, Tom Hartman, on The Big Picture, which if you haven't caught it, check it out. It's well worth getting into. He talks about it. He says, the middle class, what we think about as the individual nuclear family with the car and the mortgage and the comfortable lifestyle, is not actually a natural occurrence in capitalism. Capitalism separates people into classes very quickly because it creates a kind of a makers and owners mentality, and the workers and the owners of, and it widens the divide as we've been seeing, as we've been lowering tariffs and freeing up trade. The middle class has to be manufactured by government policy, by tariffs, by government programs, by education. Absolutely.
It has to be manufactured and created by government policy. Now, I'm not necessarily a pro-government guy, one way or the other, but we'll talk about that in a minute. But that came along with that rise in the American domination of the global system that Sonny was talking about. It also came along with this rise of the middle class. And both of those things were manufactured by tariffs, high taxes on the rich,
unions,
and huge
wages,
social programs.
Yeah.
Education being one of them, estates and infrastructure programs, massive infrastructure programs. So that was definitely a massive part of that.
I mean, have you been to the States?
I haven't. No, I'm just going off blogs and research and
with
stuff
my,
I watch.
with my very brief visit, it was like L.A., Vegas, and San Francisco, the one thing that really shocked me, I mean, Los Angeles, San Francisco, two of the biggest, most famous cities in the world, their infrastructure, their roads, they're falling apart. It's like, I was in disbelief. You go to a country like Germany, and you go to America. America feels like the third world. I mean, economically, on paper, on the sale of culture, Hollywood, and so on and so on. Most people are not aware of that massive gap. But honestly, if you just look around at the state of the infrastructure, the state of the roads, the state of the public transport, hospitals, so on and so on, America is pretty dilapidated in a poor state compared to Germany and other Western European countries.
No, definitely. Like, it's this really interesting dichotomy because they are still the powerhouse of the global economy. You could argue the Euro and the European Union rivals them at the moment. They're kind of on parity size-wise almost, and that's the big deal about the BRICS, the BRICS countries, which are China, India, South Africa, Brazil, and Russia, because they're forming this kind of block to create a different economic structure. And that we're not going into twos and fro's of that. That's quite a large process in itself. But coming back for a minute to the idea of that government moment and the market, which is where we were getting at before. There's something... So what government did in that time was create the middle class and create the greatest economic expansion, and the largest slice of middle class in American history. So what happened? And is government actually the root of that problem, or is it going to solve the problem? How do you kind of fluctuate between those two, or how do you understand what's happening? Now, I think what's important to think about here, and this is going to be a long bow to draw, but I'm going to draw it anyway. I think what's happening is the more of the market you have, the more extremes you'll get to.
Yeah.
So America has, for example, one of the largest wealth to poor gaps in the world, and it has possibly one of the freest internal and external market systems in the world, although, a lot of their policies have been protectionist for a long time. In terms of their own market, they have less and less regulation in terms of, say, Euro and Australia and all this kind of stuff in terms of environment, minimum wage rates. They have more of a market in terms of those things. Education's another one. They have a very unregulated education system. So what you do is you get these extremes. So the more of the market you've got, the more extremes you'll get. You'll get more of the top 95% and the bottom 5%. And the more you eliminate the market or you regulate the market, you get a much more...
You mean top 5, bottom 95?
Yes. So no, top 5, bottom 5.
Oh, yeah.
So the more government regulation and government input you have on the market, you get a lot more of the market sitting in...
crushing the bell curve, essentially.
Yeah.
Kind of flattening it out.
That's what you end up doing. That's what government ends up doing. It ends up trying to lift the bottom 5%.
Yeah.
And bring down or tax or in one way kind of affect the top 5%. It says we should be kind of evening out the playing field. Leveling the bell curve is a great way to say it, I think. And the more of the market you have, the more of the bell curve you'll end up having, or the more of the bigger the curve you make. Well, so the good example here is a friend of mine came back from the States recently. And this is not a factual evidence based. I haven't got stats for this example. This is just an analogy, so to speak. When you go to a restaurant in Melbourne, even if it's the local Chinese place at the corner of your shops, or the dodgy pizza place on the end that you get pizza from on Friday nights, fish and chips, whatever it is, you'll get a base quality of food. Right? You'll get a base quality of food that's edible, that is, as long as they haven't completely stuffed things up, it's not going to poison you, etc., etc. And a lot of that's through government intervention. It's through the idea that we have regulations on food standards, health and safety, etc., etc. When you go to America and you have less of that, what you do is you get a lot more food for your money, because people come over and talk about how big their coffees were and how big their plates of chips were for $6 and how big their meat was and their steaks were. Yeah. But the quality of food is terrible, and the regulations around that food is also pretty terrible. But at the same time, as well as getting this increase in the bottom 5% of food service, was the analogy, you also get this extreme other end, which is food that is absolutely mind-blowing, but you've got to pay hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of dollars for per meal. So you get this ridiculous kind of drop in the middle, and you get extremes. You either get extreme wealth and opulence and crazy food that costs the most it can ever cost on the planet, or you get super, super cheap food that's super average quality that costs $6 and you get more of it. Whereas the Australian contrast, of course, is that you don't get that. You get this kind of... It's all kind of... Like if you go to get Chinese takeout or a capricciosa pizza, chances are it's going to be pretty similar no matter what pizza shop you go to or what Chinese place you go to. But you'll always get a base standard of quality that comes with that because we have that government intervention.
In principle, I absolutely agree. I'll have to... perhaps the example doesn't translate necessarily... to the food or in every city, because the one thing that comes from my stories of being in America was really good cheap food from a local Mexican place. I'm pretty sure they would fail health and safety standards.
Well, that's my point. Like perhaps you had a strong constitution and you survived.
Maybe it's my ironclad stomach, but and I think like the amount of sort of fat and salt that was in the food.
You ran the gauntlet there. You ran the takeout gauntlet. But anyway, so I think what we're getting at is government doesn't solve the problem and government doesn't create the problem, but it's also not going to be the saviour either. And this is what we're coming on to next.
You're looking at a problem of, terrible inequality that's there. We have this governing bureaucracy that has been taken over by these corporations. And unfortunately what you're having is in parallel... In Australia, America, and so on, you're having a growth in the government, but while it's still representing the corporation, and without having a growth in the services, in a way, it's the worst of both worlds. This bureaucracy is growing itself out of some kind of self-interest, while not serving the people for which it's meant to exist in the first place.
Well, that's interesting. Let's pick up on that point for a sec, because I think that's definitely happening. And what we get is... Again, I think I'm gonna semi kind of quote Tom Hartman again and say that it's socialism for the rich and capitalism for the poor. So the poor live and die by the sword. They make their own way, and if they fail, they fall by the wayside, and they're one of the fallen. But the rich, the banks, the big corporations like GM in the States, the banks recently, other corporations like insurance companies, all got bailed out by the banks. So you have this socialism for the rich, because the corporations and the rich, well, the rich is the wrong word. Socialism for the corporations and the people who own those big entities in society get socialism because they can't afford to go to the wall. Yeah. But they can use that same mentality in terms of you go to the wall against the people they loan money to. Yeah. So it's this ridiculous dichotomy of we're too important to fail, but everyday man, everyday individuals and families and women and men and individuals are very apt to failing. You can fail, we just can't fail. So it's this socialism for the rich where the government bails you out versus capitalism for the poor, and it's such a fascinating dichotomy.
Those people that are at risk at losing their private jet get protection, but those people at the risk of losing the roof over their head, well, too bad, son. Such is life. This is, doctrine of personal responsibility. You live and fail by the quality of your own actions.
Most definitely. And again, we're coming to our next point, which is, we have this, again, possibly a false dichotomy between personal responsibility and the common good, where the people who critique things like the common good, universal education, universal healthcare, say it's socialism and it's government entering into your own medicine relationship with your doctor, and and people who espouse the common good say that, well, hang on, if I've got a broken leg and I rock up to the doctor's office, I'm not going to look for a menu of doctors and choose the best one. I'm just going to go help me and fix my leg.
Yeah.
So it's really a false discussion. You know, I don't think you can really afford to be talking about this when you're talking about things like healthcare and education. But interestingly enough, this brings us to our next point, is that we get into the rise, the current and very recent rise in terms of since the GFC, pretty much, of anti-establishment politics. So we have a few things to discuss here, and I'll try and be brief if I can, and Stanley will keep interjecting when he can get a word in edgeways. We have Bernie Sanders versus the Socialists, Sanders versus Democratic establishment. In Australia, we have Greens versus Labor, and in America, again, I'm going to use the last American example here, Ron and Rand Paul, or the true libertarian wing of the Republican Party versus the Republican Party establishment. So, what I found interesting recently was reading an article in The Nation, and I have a lovely friend of mine who got me a subscription to The Nation. It's a fantastic read if you like politics and intellectualism and interesting things. But there was this critique from the Socialist council member. I think she's the council member. I think she's a governor. And I can't think of her name offhand, but very empowered, interesting woman. She is part of Socialist Alternative. She got elected to I think local council or some sort of local governing body in Seattle. And she raised the minimum wage. She got minimum wage level passed, which was amazing. She did some amazing things. She's doing some amazing things. Yeah. She's up for re-election very shortly, actually, and they've changed the system on her, which is a bit shit, I think. I'm not sure whether she's happy about it or not. You have to get her comment on that. But I read the article from her about Sanders, well, about other things, but also about Sanders in The Nation. And she was heavily critiquing Bernie Sanders because he went inside the Democratic Party to run for president, and he's doing well. And her critique was, you shouldn't be... That's her there. You shouldn't be running in the Democratic Party, Bernie. You know, if you call yourself a socialist, you should be running as an independent. You should gain a real pulpit to have these issues on a national stage. What are you doing? You're stuffing this up. And when you talk to Bernie about what he did and why he did it and why he ran in the Democrats, he says, well, I made a decision a little while back that the Democratic Party was the best option we have for achieving power and making change. You know, he it didn't say exactly this, something to that effect. He still caucuses with the Democrats, and he runs against Republicans all the time because he thinks they're really intensely a bunch of lunatics, I think is a good way to say it. And so there's this kind of dichotomy between, what the socialist governor, Kshama Sawant, calls real socialism, and Bernie Sanders, who is a democratic socialist or a social democrat. And you get this fight inside the left, and you could call Bernie much further left than the Democrats or the Labor Party in the UK or Australia. You have this socialist critiquing a social democrat who's trying to achieve power. And there's various arguments to and for that, but it's a fascinating discussion around who has the right answer there. Because clearly, if you ran as an independent, just like Ralph Nader did, just like... who was the other guy? He was a business guy in the late 80s. He ran against Bush and Clinton, I think. The independents get marginalised very quickly if you're not part of those parties, and you don't really get a crack at the actual spot because you end up losing... Like, you end up pulling votes away from one of the two main choices.
Ross
Perot, thank you. You end up losing votes from one of the two main choices, and you don't really get a crack at the actual leadership. So Bernie must have had a look at that and thought, well, I can try, because he's been independent all his life, all his political life. He since the 70s, he's been running as independent and has always won, even though he's caucused, in other words, he's voted with the Democrats. He's always been an independent. And he must have looked at it and said, well, I can run an independent campaign and try and get on the ticket and try and do what Nader and Perot couldn't do. And Ralph Nader is an amazing man. And
Ross Perot's net worth is $4.1 billion, so he wasn't even short of money.
Ross Perot is an interesting dude. But, you could try and do that, or you could go back into the party system, just like Bernie Sanders and Donald Trump, and Ron Paul did, and try and change the party from within by taking power. So to try and do that. Now, I don't agree with the fact that, I don't agree with the socialist governor. Is she a governor?
Someone became a social activist, part-time economics professor in Seattle, part-time teaching positions, unsuccessfully before winning a seat on the Seattle City Council.
There you
So
go.
she's
Yeah,
in
she's
city
in, she's in the city council. I don't agree with her analysis of Bernie. At the same time, I can see her point. But let's go on for a minute to Sanders versus Democratic, and this is where she doesn't see the difference. So she puts Sanders in with the Democratic establishment now that he's running with the Democratic Party, rather than seeing the differences in the two. And I would say there's a huge difference in the two. And if you look at Sanders versus Clinton and Hillary Clinton, and you look at their policies and what they're talking about and the crowds they're drawing and their messages, they're very, very different. He is speaking to a progressive part of the Democratic base that is really looking for someone to lead them that isn't part of the establishment, isn't part of the Clinton, Obama / party politics. He's not taking any super PAC donations. He's raised almost as much money as Clinton last quarter. He's doing some interesting things, and I think at some point the left, the real left, the socialist left, the progressive left, and whatever other left you want to talk about in the States, has to get behind him for him to do anything, and he talks about it when he talks about his campaign speeches. So I think that has to happen. The same thing can be said if we take it to an Australian context, Greens versus Labor. So back to that comment about my friend about, he was like, vote for Labor because we don't want to give Abbott power, because you shouldn't vote Greens, even though we should vote Greens. We shouldn't vote Greens in this election when Abbott beat Gillard first time, because we don't want Abbott to have power. And that's short-term politicking for long-term loss. We're not seeing the point.
Yeah.
We have to get behind anti-establishment candidates that are willing to take power in major parties, at least temporarily, to get any change done.
In fact, if you're very, very pragmatic, you'd probably say vote for Abbott, vote for Tony, go Tony, because the bigger idiot, the bigger right-wing representing idiot you have in power, the more it will mobilize, the sensible part of the population against him.
Oh, it was amazing to see the rise of protests in Melbourne again when Abbott took power. You had, I was attending some Adam Bant rallies and on the State Library in Melbourne, and they were like, this is the first time people have protested. And you asked them that, and they said, yeah, this is the first time protested. I'm just so unhappy with the rise of this right-wing conservative nutter that when he took power, we've energised the left. But this is where we really have to, we have to get behind those parties.
Obama, with no opposition, bombs Libya, bombs Syria, escalates the situation in Afghanistan, Iraq, 5-6 wars, bombs Pakistan, drones millions of people. That's an exaggeration, tens of thousands. Nothing. There's no anti-war protests. But when there was a right-wing nut, and by the name of George W. Bush, he had to stop and slow down because the anti-war movement was so mobilized. He was literally risking the whole political system if he attacked Iran or something like that.
The funny thing is that he has risked the system in terms of what we're seeing now. So we're seeing the rise of the Greens, of Sanders, of Jeremy Corbyn in the UK.
Jeremy Corbyn in the UK, very, 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 very interesting. Apparently, they changed the voting system for within the party and how it works. They made it more democratic. They didn't necessarily. They believed that they wouldn't affect anything in the short-term future, but the very left wing of the Labour Party, who ran different candidates at different times and never really got anyone into power, said, well, which one of us hasn't run yet? And Jeremy Corbyn, who's never had leadership positions in anything, they just thought, well, he's an impeccably credible guy. All of this anti-austerity, workers' movements, the guy's been going to union protests going back 30, 40 years. He's there every time. So they just said, look, this guy's pretty credible, and he is genuinely anti-establishment. Maybe the voters are going to go for this. And hell yeah, the voters did. And I don't know. I don't think Jeremy Corbyn has got the kind of rhetorical command of that clown of a human being called David Cameron. But fundamentally, I think when somebody has a lifelong track record of protecting the disadvantaged, of egalitarianism,
like a Sanders or the Greens party,
yeah, or standing up against his own interests, against the powers that be, or the sort of dominant currents within his own party. I think people can recognize something genuine, and I think Jeremy Corbyn is a genuinely good person that wants. Every politician will tell you, I want the best for every citizen of this country, peace, freedom, prosperity, all of that. He's a guy that's voted against every war, every invasion that's ever been voted for. It's not, Obama was against the war in Iraq and got elected on the basis of being against the war in Iraq, and then went on to bomb 5 countries. Like, people can actually count on somebody like Sanders and Corbyn not to keep bombing Arab, brown, whatever countries into oblivion. Because for, a very long... These are older dudes, and for a very, very long time, they've been very consistent in those positions. And perhaps that's, at the end of the day, in a totally lying, cynical age of politics, perhaps that's the only thing that we can trust at this stage.
Well, it's really interesting analysis, because I think it's probably something very genuine about that, and people are responding to Corbyn's authenticity, to Sanders' authenticity, to, dare I say it, to Trump, Fiorina and Carson's authenticity and non-establishment links. So if I shift to the right for a minute, because we've focused on the left for a while,
I can't help it. I have to apologize. I actually like Donald Trump. He's like, I have such a good time hearing his speeches.
You do have to apologize for that. That's terrible. No, it's fascinating because you look at what's happening, and for the last, since the rise of Obama, but even before that, when Obama took power in 2008, there was this kind of Tea Party, extreme right wing faction of the Republican Party, and they were anti-government. Like, government is just bad, except where national defence is concerned.
Oh yeah,
or the protection of private property. And they were very anti-government except where religion was concerned, where there needed to be a Christian society. There's definitely a pull to that one as well. So you had these kind of factions in the party that have come out, and how they've expressed themselves is because they've been so effective in stifling a lot of what Obama's tried to do in the last 8 years. They've now got a voice on the national stage that has become, I would argue, the expression of people who are looking for anti-establishment politics. It's just that, so if you look at the anti-establishment candidates and the Tea Party libertarian candidates in the Republican field right now, 2015 Republican primary, you're looking at Rand Paul, Ted Cruz, particular big Tea Party libertarian style types. You're looking at Trump, Fiorina and Carson as the anti-establishment types, which is what libertarian the faction has played off for a long time, that we're not part of the John Boehner, Mitt Romney, Newt Gingrich establishment that are given cred by the party itself. So you have these kind of links between the two, and what's happening now is that they've lost control of the message. So if you listen to what the Republicans say in their debates, when you've got Trump, Fiorina, Kasich, Jeb Bush, Ted Cruz, Rand Paul, Chris Christie, all these guys on stage, Carly Fiorina, Marco Rubio, etc., they all give the same message, and the message is government is bad. We need to get it out of your healthcare relationship with your doctor, because you should be able to assess your doctor in some ridiculous type menu-style fashion where you gauge what person you want to fix your disease while you're sick or whatever else. And the deficit is bad and we can't spend money, and government education is bad, and they have all the same message. They just have different talking points in that message. So Trump is anti-immigration and is anti-Mexican and anti-Syrian.
I need to interject one thing.
Sure.
Trump is... first things first, he is against money in politics. Probably, maybe he's not against money in politics because he says, look, I know how it works. I bribe politicians all the time. I mean, I just love when the guy says something like that because...
he's telling truth to power in a really weird way.
I bribe politicians all the time.
Totally agree.
But, he's basically, showing that the system is inherently corrupt and, as far as the money in politics, he's saying all the right things. And as far as protectionism, he's saying the right things. He's like, well, all these plants move to Mexico. All I'm going to do is say, hey, there's a 30% tariffs when cars go from over there to over here. And pretty soon, they'll have a million good reasons to start reopening plants in America. And because none of them funded my campaign like they did of any one of these people on the stage with me here, I will be able to say no to them when they come knocking.
Well, hang on. Can I just pull you up there? His policies don't. This is the problem with Trump. He's saying the right things in that respect, but the problem is that
he doesn't have policies, man. He hasn't thought things out.
He has no way to do that because they've signed NAFTA, they've signed free trade agreements which say they can't institute tariffs again. They aren't allowed to do that.
He'll probably get arrested. He'll probably get on the phone to the Mexican president and say, "No way, Jose, I'm not doing this. I'm Trump."
Yeah.
He'll be in breach of 50 international laws.
It's a fascinating idea that he could be president. But look, getting back to what we're saying, I think that there's something inherently valuable about the anti-establishment parties that are coming up, but what we end up getting caught in is this kind of conversation with the left, which is around Sanders and socialism and what's called, like, he's not really a socialist, he's a welfare statist, but he's, this idea that the state can provide or government can look after you, versus this extreme right of zero government, all market, except in certain areas that we deem appropriate for the market to intervene in. And everyone else, the establishment, is somewhere in the middle. Of course, what's happened is, because of the Tea Party and what's happened in the last 8 years, I would argue, we have the anti-establishment candidates currently, Trump, Fiorina, Carson, and a few other ones, like Ted Cruz and Rand Paul, who's not really anti-establishment, but compared to Jeb Bush he is. They're finding expression in the fact that the Tea Party and the anti-establishment guys have been so good at painting them as in with Washington clickers, in with those power structures, that now Trump is the logical kind of end to that.
Yeah.
That the fact that, okay, so you don't want corruption. I'm a rich guy and I can be president.
Yeah. Which
destroys the whole point of being an elected president. The idea is anyone should be able to run for president. Yeah. But he's saying, no, the system's corrupt. It's all a bunch of rich dudes. But I'm rich. I won't take any of their money. I'll use my own money, and I can essentially buy the office. And I can buy the presidency. Because I've got so much money to run my own campaign.
And this is the kind of golden irony, is that he is right. The system is at the moment so corrupt that compared to that, to everyone standing on the stage with him there, he is by far the least corrupt option. He's a completely corrupt option. The idea that somebody buys the position of head of state, or that you should trust somebody because they're rich enough not to be bribed. I mean, that way of thinking, in this race to the bottom of any type of rationality, any type of political ideology that the Republican Party is, the billionaire buying the election's the least corrupt of anyone on that stage.
It's fascinating, isn't it?
Yeah.
Genuinely a fascinating kind of idea. But look, we're going to move on from that for a minute, because I think we've established that it's inherently corrupt. The two-party preferred system is corrupt because the party votes with the party and it's not representative. I personally think we should get behind people like Sanders and the Greens in Victoria, in Australia, even though they're not the solve for this. They're not going to solve the problems. They're definitely the far better option on the ticket versus Greens versus Labor, and we have to play the long game.
Yeah,
and with this kind of stuff, you have to kind of make choices around that. You can't walk away from the system. Like, it doesn't end with your vote. Like, this is the whole political cry that your politics doesn't end with your vote on one Saturday every 3 years and you go back to sleep. You should be advocating for other things and involved in discussions and involved in movements like the Zeitgeist movement, etc. But let's get on to Zeitgeist for a minute, because it's important, I think, to come back to what we're talking about, which is the Zeitgeist movement. This is the Melbourne radio show. How does this relate to the movement?
Well, you have, and perhaps this is going to be a bit of a tangent, but I feel it's worth explaining. You've kind of got in the alternative a choice of extreme left or extreme right. The doctrine of personal responsibility and free trade. You are worth what your skills and your labor is worth to the market. If that's hundreds of millions, good, you'll be a multimillionaire. If that's $200 a year, good, you're going to starve to death and human race will be better off without your irrelevant ass. I mean, they say they don't think that way. They believe in charity at the same time, while believing that somebody's worthless but they still believe in charity. But you have this kind of far right ideology, and you have also, on the other hand, a far left one, which I think is a little bit too, I don't know what the best word is, reactionary, reflexive. Everything is a power relationship. We can't have any kind of economic interaction in this system without some party in that interaction being exploited. We want to take care of the common good in a very grand, in a very large-scale manner. I mean, we've, through bureaucracies that take care of every part of having your needs met, and somehow we're going to have this kind of left-wing system where we have capitalism and also massive taxes and all these social programs. I don't really think that either of those is, in a way, they are a false dichotomy, because you need a mixture of economic security and personal freedom, and you're basically falsely tying the personal freedom, the capitalist thing, they have a monopoly on personal freedom, and sort of the left believes that they have the monopoly on the human good and your security, and that they know what's best for you.
Well, hang on, I'm going to pull you up there. So it is a false dichotomy, but I don't think it's a false dichotomy in terms of the way you're painting it.
Okay.
So there's a tension between the idea that the government provides something for you inherently because you're valuable.
Yeah.
And the government being out of the way so you can make your own choices and decisions, like you have exactly the same agency and resources as everyone. And this is the problem, is that it's not so much government is good or bad in either way. Government is the fix of a problem of an inherently structural issue. So if I want to have, like, let's broad brushstroke it in big chunks for a minute, very quickly, and say that if I want to have private property and I don't want to have people as particular slaves to anyone in terms of overtly, and I don't want to tell people what to do, but want them to figure out their own kind of selves in some obtuse, abstract, but very practical kind of way, where if I want to become a doctor, I can go and study medicine rather than being told what society needs. I'm better off creating a system that allows private property to a certain extent, but gives people a certain amount of agency to make those choices. So if I want to be a doctor, or if I want everyone the chance to be able to become a doctor, if I want to give everyone that chance, or a lawyer or a politician or whatever, I need to put in place educational structures that give everyone a base level of education. That means they can compete on a semi-equal playing field and therefore kind of write their own ticket, so to speak. But of course, where it falls down, I think, is that if the government doesn't tell you what to do in that respect, they just say, well, here's your education and here's your healthcare paid for by your taxes. You get free doctor visits, you get school, and you get roads, and we just let society run the way it's running as long as we have a police force and etc., etc. The government doesn't tell you what to do, sure. The market ends up being its own type of dictatorship. So let's just say you wanted to have a whole bunch of engineers working on 3D printers to print houses.
Yeah.
Is there a market for that? Well, yes and no. So, if there's no market for it, whether it be a 3D printed house, an electric car, heaps of paintings in people's houses, it won't be done. The market becomes its own kind of dictatorship. It becomes a dictatorship of the market over the person.
You can give an even better example. A cure for cancer. That, in the shape of a single pill or something. I mean, you know, it's a ridiculous example, but there is no, you know, look at AIDS research. I mean, most of the focus is, and they've successfully prolonged lives of people in Western countries with that disease. You know, life expectancy is massive, 30 to 40 years. But the business model of we solve problems if we can develop a business that provides a return on investment. If we were to search for the ideal plant that cures a disease, where, you know, anybody could get the seeds at the market for a few cents and cure whatever, maybe infections, maybe whatever disease, no business would invest in that, because you can't, you know, we only get solutions that are in the format that can be profited from. And
all right, so can I just understand that a bit better?
Yes.
From what you've, like, all right, so I think, using your example, I think what you're saying is, and stop me if I'm wrong, is that there is no money in a straight cure for cancer because you'd have a limited market. Whereas there is money in prolonging life with cancer drugs that allow people, that allow people a lot more money, that allow companies to keep. But now, I'm not saying, I'm not going to sit here and say there's a cure for cancer out there, and people know.
I don't think there is, but I think that people are really not looking for the cure because there is no interest in the cure.
Well, perhaps there's no money in that. There's more money in solving the problems associated with cancer that allow people to keep living.
Yeah.
Yes. So it's the same with electric cars. If I sell you an electric car once that goes 500,000 kilometres, needs no servicing, charges off your wall socket, and you can run it off your solar panels on top of your roof, I've destroyed the service industry. I've destroyed the engine manufacturers. I've destroyed whole chunks of the economy. So there's a market there, but the larger market is in this other stuff. Yeah. It's the same with 3D printed houses. There's much of a market in a building industry than there is in just popping houses out of a 3D printer that work for everyone in 20 basic formats or whatever else. So this idea of choice is bound up in what the individual chooses to do with their money in the market. It's bound up in their idea of who they are in terms of job specialisation or industry they work in, and it's tied up in who dictates or how it's dictated that I should make my decisions, or at least the options I get to choose when I make my decisions. Now, that can be a government or an organisation. Again, if you walk into your job, there's no choice there. You've got to do what you're employed to do. That's a dictatorship. It's not democratic. Exactly the same with if we had some sort of dystopian communist Stalinist, which is not communism or socialism, but authoritarian communism style setup. You don't get any choice because the government tells you what to do or what production is. But I think that the market doing it in that respect, and this is the one argument for something like the market, is that it's not necessarily a person doing it. It's the market which is not necessarily, parentheses, but seems impartial. So the market seems like it's not dictating to you what you can do. It's just dictating to the choices based on what the overall market says.
That is such a great point.
Because I don't know that that's actually the case. The market is its own dictatorship. Like, the great example of this is if you ask anyone what they want to do, what they would do if money was no object, not a huge percentage of the population,
very small, would say their own job,
would say they're already doing it.
Yeah.
I don't know what they would say. They probably wouldn't. They actually probably say, I don't know. They'd probably say, I don't know. You know, I wouldn't be an accountant. I wouldn't do this. I do this for money. You know, people are forced into specialisation and jobs for money to survive, etc., etc. But they aren't even given the choice to do something that, you know, like we might have a lot more artists. Might have a lot more farmers. We might have a lot more engineers. We might have a lot more of these people that are doing things they love rather than doing things for money. And that's the dictatorship of the market. The market only gives you a limited set of choices based on what it offers by what's valued in the society itself. And in liberal democracy, Western capitalist democracies, it's accountants and bankers and lawyers and doctors. And the funny thing is, I work in a school as a career counsellor. And what we get is, the first question I'm asked, generally by young people, if we're exploring a job in the job guide or online and we're checking out what they do and how it works, and if they've come up with this idea and we're looking at, you know, what their day-to-day life will be, is how much does it pay, sir? And you kind of shake your head and you go, money's not important. Yeah, and I
forget it. Yeah.
Give them the kind of the rhetoric of money's not important because if you're happy at your job and you love what you do, money won't be a problem. We have a minimum wage in Australia and I can afford to make that kind of vague statement. But in essence, money is super important in this capitalist structure because it's the method by which you survive, because you purchase your survival rather than survival being inherent.
There's a certain... And, you know, if anything, right now, we're actually onto something in this radio show that I'd say is a fairly original insight. Firstly, the idea of freedom. I mean, we've been sold this. There's a system. There's a system that votes for ideas. There are no individuals there. Nobody is telling society this is how we're going to spend our money. Nobody's saying we're going to have a space program. Nobody's saying we're... No. There's a system that votes on ideas, and this is how venture capitalism works. This is how money goes behind, that elects and puts money behind the most profitable ideas. Are the most profitable ideas the best for humanity? You can't make the argument that they are, because the most profitable thing out there is like high frequency trading and hedge funds and, you know, economic speculation with an inside edge on the market that happens to be legal for this moment. Those are the most profitable ideas in the world. And to a large extent, you know, free market proponents, you know, are a little flabbergasted when they find out that things like the internet, the transmission, you're hearing us through an encoding of our voice through ones and zeros that's being thrown in the air through electromagnetic waves with massive wavelengths. And the way those waves are packed into ones and zeros and the way they're separated is all done by blue sky science, by publicly funded scientists who were, for the most part, when they were doing a bunch of maths that was not related to anything in the market. They had no product to sell. They were not funded by a corporation. They were not... So a lot of the science and the maths that we use, that's running the internet, that's running this communications revolution that we're in, was discovered by people who had open-ended funding, who just happened to do some maths.
And might add to that, from the government.
From the government.
Chomsky talks about this in one of his addresses. Again, I can't quote him exactly. I haven't got the quote, and I'm not that good with the quotes in terms of my head. But he basically said that the internet and things like that were developed by government first inside the infrastructure for government purposes, and then were taken as free intellectual property to be exploited in the market by AT&T and Apple and all these people. So you have a transfer of the research and development costs from these companies who didn't do any of that, or didn't do a chunk of it to start with, like things like the internet and things like that, from the government. So we ended up paying for it through our taxes in these big research development areas, like inside the Department of Defense in the States, which did the internet, I think, and this kind of stuff.
It was DARPANET, basically. That was the internet.
That was the start of it, paid for by taxpayer, transferred into the public sector for private ownership by corporations to then charge us for. It's exactly the same as the public transport companies around the world who want to privatise our transport networks. It's like we paid for the development and building of them through our taxes, and then we hire legislators, we elect legislators to give them to private corporations to profit off when they didn't actually build the infrastructure in the first place. And that's completely ridiculous. It's this ridiculous notion. Why aren't we keeping that? The big thing in the 80s, of course, was the sell-off of Telstra. We had this massive infrastructure development network, we had this massive communications network that we built that was huge and was a monopoly in the market, in no sense, but it was providing cheap communication Australia-wide. It wasn't discriminating based on if you were in a country or a city. Like, that was the big thing when they privatised. Everyone in the country was screaming because they were just shutting exchanges down and defunding networks in the country. If you weren't a big city, you weren't a big priority when they privatised Telstra. It was providing them all equally to everyone in a kind of a, dare I say it, socialist-style way. Yeah. And they privatised it, and it went to crap. And the prices shot up, and the service dropped, and all of a sudden people in the country were losing out because they weren't seen as important, because the market wasn't there. Which comes back to one of my original points, is when the market is there, or when the market's mandated, you get equal service. Well, when the market is not there, because the market was in the cities and the countries, you get less, you get a change in the way the service works. And that's part of the problem of privatising infrastructure, and the fact that government is not necessarily the root of all evil, but also can't solve all the problems.
And I mean, anarcho-capitalists will try to argue that the market is the desires of the people. But, people desire a world without war. People desire green energy. Abundant, cheap green energy. Most people have a strong wish for these things. But there is no business model for them. There is no business model that's going to make profit out of peace. And so, here's the question that I ask you. What is a better management system for large groups of people? Either a dictatorship of money-making ventures, where most of our human resources, our labor, our genius, our smart people goes towards projects that can be converted to money most efficiently, or simply an organized vision of what is good for humanity. Why don't we have a Manhattan Project for finding a battery solution that would basically, solar cells are cheap and efficient enough to power the whole world if we only had batteries. That's it. We already have the technology for the green future is already here. All you need is a cheap enough battery, and we're done. We don't have to worry about nuclear. We don't have to worry about coal. We don't. The cars, after you have a cheap and efficient battery, there's going to be no reason to burn fuel on the roads.
Well, it's an interesting space, because that gets back to what we were talking about before, about the idea there's no profit in selling you something once. And so this is...
But it's not exactly. The battery is not a profitable idea, because it comes in with a bunch of panels under the roof of your house, which are sold once and probably never again, with a car that requires next to no service. And it's a terrible thing for business.
Well, hang on. I'm going to... let's play devil's advocate for a minute.
Yeah.
Because we're going to wrap this up in a few minutes. But let's play devil's advocate for a minute on that point. So let's have a look at Tesla. So the home battery and the solar panels and the electric cars. I remember reading something about what he was offering in terms of solar panels. And this is a very shrewd idea.
Solar City, yeah.
Yeah, this is a very shrewd idea.
You're talking about Solar City, Elon Musk's company, like the way...
Yeah, well, yeah. He wasn't offering you to buy the panels.
Yeah, it was...
What he would do was he would lease the panels to you, come and install them, maintain them, and lease them, and you could lease them off him, and they would supply you with power. And then he had this equation which made it cheaper over time, and eventually it became free. But it would take time after the leasing was done for you to actually get to parity with what you're spending with the normal power companies. So he's trying to square the circle, in one respect. He's trying to find profit in the green solutions. He's trying to find profit that's ongoing profit, more to the point, in green solutions. Again, because there are solar companies out there that do solar panels that will sell you them, and they'll warranty them, and then go away, we're done. Limited market there. There's an opening there, but it's a limited kind of market. So you've got a finite amount of profit you can derive from that over time. Whereas he looked at it and he went, well, how about I lease you this power system, and you pay it off as you go, and eventually it gets cheaper and cheaper and cheaper to the point where you're achieving parity or beating what's coming off the grid and what you're paying on your normal bills. The problem, of course, is that it's still based in a hierarchical, profit-driven structure where there's no guarantee that that is, A, going to work for everyone, and B, there's no necessary way to democratize that.
Yeah. Well, secondly, even... this is a big undertaking. I mean, he has a lot of money, a lot of funding behind him, and he probably the only billionaire I can think of that is putting his resources, for the most part, in such a way that's genuinely out to benefit humanity.
Which is interesting.
People will bring up things like Bill Gates, but I mean, look, I will not go into it, but there's plenty of doubt about his philanthropy. Every billionaire, by the way, guys, every single billionaire is a philanthropist if you Google their Wikipedia page. Every single one of them. So anyone with the mentality that they want to hoard money and resources to the point where those resources reach past thousands of millions, which is what a billion is by definition a philanthropist, which is a person that gives from what he has to society, which is the ultimate paradox in itself. Like, a billionaire philanthropist in actual reality is so close to an oxymoron. It takes someone like Elon Musk to actually make it work, which is, one person I can think of on planet Earth. But yeah, the Powerwall isn't good enough. I've looked at the specs.
Really?
No, it doesn't. If you buy one in Australia, it won't pay itself off in a decade, and it's not quite there yet. But it's a huge step in the right direction, and I really think I think the company Tesla will probably get there in the next decade. From what I can see with this cutting edge research, they're really the only ones putting massive resources behind it. So like that. As far as billionaire people go, I'm a fan of that. I think we might have a question from Andrew Kinch. Considering that the internet has connected the world to the point that lining up to vote at the local school is less efficient option instead of the intelligent way of organizing constituencies, do you think there's any kind of adaptation to the current system looking into? An RBE clearly requires transitional systems, and the basic income meets some of those needs. What might we use to transition politics into a direct democracy? Wow. I suppose we just got to define what direct democracy is. It's a system where there are referendums, probably dozens of referendums each year, where people vote directly on issues. It solves the problem that we brought up in the beginning. Like, you vote for a party, you vote for a bucket of ideas, which is ridiculous. Like, nobody, you can't pick 100 people and they would not naturally have the same views on anything from economics to gay marriage to immigrants. So a direct democracy would be a more fair, more democratic system than the one we presently have, and the internet would be the ultimate way to implement it. But how connected is the resource-based economy and a direct democracy? I don't know. I don't want to speak for people that create the ideas of the RBE, but I would say that it is meant to be a system that accounts for economically accounts for what we have and what we invest in real terms, in terms of resources rather than in terms of money. So when you're making something, what is the damage? What is the footprint that it's going to take to create it? What are the
true costs? The
true costs.
Yeah, rather than the externalized costs, which is another thing, economics and market driven altogether. But let's
go for it.
No, I was going to say it's an interesting question. So how do we get to an RBE from a direct democratic model? I don't know that we can, and the reason I think that I'm not sure we can is multiple reasons. The first is that when you base a system like democracy, on self-interest, which is the idea that every individual has their own interest and they vote for whoever they want to vote for, and that's a representation of the people, and then the governance happens. A democratic system, a very broad stroke, very broad definition there, but the idea is the individual and their interests are represented. When you have self-interest and you have limited resources, you can't necessarily make the two work together. But when you have an abundance, which is what a resource-based economy would advocate and bring about, you'd have no need for self-interest. So you have no need for democratic processes. So the two are inherently, I think, in conflict. In one respect, you've got democracy based on the individual interests of everyone, and based on the idea that you can have your views represented in democracy, and therefore if you don't want this resource plundered, or if you want to make sure you have enough things to do your thing, you're okay. But that is based on the idea of course, limited resources. And with an RBE, with a resource-based economy, which would hopefully create what we call abundance, which is what the movement advocates for, Zeitgeist movement advocates for, again, you wouldn't need to have your individual interests guarded in terms of the amount of resources I can maintain and the amount of resources I need to do stuff, and I need to have my interests looked out for, because your interests are no longer based in this kind of limited or finite structure, which is what we have now when we have limited resources. You wouldn't necessarily need a democracy in the first place. So the closest way to understand this, I think, is to have a look at something like a Star Trek style universe. And this is a massive bow I'm drawing here. Again, I like drawing massive bows today. It's a big, massive bow day today, Sonny. If we think about what a resource-based economy would look like and how society would look in terms of abundant food, abundant shelter, abundant resources, abundant education, abundant healthcare, everyone able to seek their own, like we look up, the society, the machines or whatever build a house for you, and you have access to food and all this kind of stuff. If we look at what that means, the closest we get to is like a Star Trek style thing. Can you imagine people in Star Trek voting for a government when they have replicators?
Yeah.
When they've explored the galaxy, populated the world in a green way, got the environment settled, everyone's got a house and food and everything, and why would you need politics? Politics is there, and this is going back to a point I said before, to fix a problem, and the problem is limited resources, an economic system that's not economic, that's based on money and limited structures, and cannot do everything for everyone as it is set up currently. And that's why politics is a fix for a current problem, which is structural, but we have to address the structure.
I would say that you would need some kind of direct democracy within it, just because like some projects are massive. You don't want to go and spend. For instance, one day we may arrive at a point where maybe in Australia, or we have a great population, we have to decide whether or not to build massive water floating cities off the coast of whatever, Tasmania. And fundamentally, how do you as a society decide on massive infrastructure projects? I'm sure that it would have to have popular support. It would make...
Well, no, again, he talks about this in one of the docos. You weigh it up based on what the area can sustain and on how big the need is, and the computer has algorithms
fundamentally, the people are either going to want to live there or not. And to find if there's enough people that want to live there, you kind of got to ask the people, and so on and so on. I mean, I'm pretty sure that you would wind up getting in situations where let's have a vote would be the best solution. But what Craig is saying is absolutely right. I mean, there is no reason, there is no natural scarcity of food, of shelter, of clean drinking water, of those basic human necessities, and the notion of working for to earn those, I would say, is something that we should work to make obsolete. And the notion, that in itself will eliminate most of what enters politics today. It's, preying on people's existential fears. Basically, such and such country, we need to arm ourselves because they'll bomb us, or such and such immigrants are going to come in and overwhelm us and have, outnumber us, and Islam's going to take over, or whatnot. I personally cannot envisage anything like the political debate we have today arising in an RBE. But I do visualize some problems that, sometimes when you're in a group of people and there is a decision to be made, you got to take a vote. I don't necessarily think it's incompatible, but I don't think that it's a mechanism for governing society, like Craig said. It's just something that would the need of which will arise between, every now and then when there is a fork in the road. But it's not a means of, voting for how the truck delivers, or whether it's the trucks or the drones, or how the road gets built, or how the bridge gets built, or 90% of what's voted for today, there'll be no sense of voting for it in an RBE. But
no, that's exactly right. I mean, it's a, and I think as time goes, that will get less and less. Yes. So let's just hypothesize for a minute that we could start instituting a resource-based economy tomorrow with technology and new science to start solving the world's problems. As we go, we would have different votes to make. We would probably have different votes about if we were going to salvage our cities or if we were going to go and build new ones. Again, on one of the movies, I think he advocates that we haven't got the resources to go back into the cities and save them. We should start again and then go back to them later, or not go back to them at all. So there's kind of a different set of ideas there, but as you go, as those decisions become less and less prominent in the forwarding of society by, when things start getting built and when things start happening, you'd have less and less of a need for that idea of any kind of political representation or democracy.
And I mean,
now,
this is a question that we are definitely, we got to talk about baby steps, about transitional steps, about how we see us evolving out of the system, and we're going to have separate radio shows and potential.
I think we have a couple of guys in the group who are going to talk about that. Yeah.
So, and that's probably the best time to answer this, to hash out sort of the pros and the cons and answer this question better. But I think we gave it a decent crack. You were saying, Craig?
Oh, I was just saying that this is, and I just want to touch on this before we finish, because we've definitely been going for an hour and a half, and we've been getting into overtime. That the Zeitgeist movement is not inherently political. It doesn't believe in the politics' ability to solve the problems, or economics' ability to solve the problems either. It's important to understand that it believes in a scientific advancement of society where science solves the problems, where we could solve the problems. People have been talking about this for a long time. Buckminster Fuller, Jacques Fresco, and others. Carl Sagan even. We could fix the world's problems. We do have the food and the resources to feed and clothe the world, even using our current economic structures, but that's a whole other minefield. But we choose not to, because we choose to propagate a political and economic structure that doesn't allow us to do that, and only allows minor changes around the edges. Now, the minor changes are important, which is what we talked about before. Voting for Bernie Sanders, voting for the Greens, voting for people that actually advocate for larger change and have an ideology and a consistent authenticity behind them is really important.
Yeah.
But they are only baby steps to a larger project, and we shouldn't take our eye off the ball when we do that. Sure, it will help in the meantime, just like every movement has, whether it be gay rights, feminist rights, women's rights, racial equality, etc., etc. Those movements have all had massive impacts, the union movement, and I'm not going to denigrate what they've done, but they are not the end goal. They are just small baby steps on the way to what we need to get to if we're ever going to turn spaceship Earth around, to use Carl Sagan and Buckminster Fuller's term. If we're ever going to turn this around properly and have a sustainable long-term society based on technology and equality for all and opportunity for all, this system doesn't really get us there.
No,
and the acknowledgement of that is the first step in this process.
Craig, I have to admire the sagacity in the conclusion. You wrapped it all up very nicely. I think we can.
I think there's many more points we could get into, but that's time for another show.
Yeah. Well, thank you all for listening. We'll be back next Sunday and every Sunday. We're going to try to aim at a 4:30 time slot. It was not possible today given the how disoriented we got by the daylight savings. But yes, now we have longer days, and we shall see you next Sunday at 4:30. Take care, y'all.
Ciao.